Welcome, everyone, to Women on the Week Roundtable Sharp Perspectives. I'm Meredith Jacobs, CEO of Jewish Women International and former editor in chief of the Washington Jewish Week. With me today, Laura Adkins, opinion editor of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. It's always weird saying that. I just want to say JTA. Laura is also an adjunct professor of journalism at the Shiva University Stern College for Women. Molly Boygan is an investigative reporter with The Forward, and she is the author of Fahrenheit 411, which I highly recommend. It's a newsletter on disinformation and the Jewish community, and that's actually a collaborative effort between The Forward and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Molly has written investigations about philanthropy tied to money laundering, school closures impacting students with autism, environmentally costly construction projects, and more. And finally, our special guest this week is Amy Spitalnick, Executive Director of Integrity First for America, a nonpartisan civil rights nonprofit backing the landmark federal lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. She previously served as communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General, leading the media and public affairs efforts on critical national legal fights. So, of course, with this incredible panel, we're going to be talking disinformation and anti-Semitism. But let's spend the first half of our time digging a little bit into the news of the week. So I think the biggest news this week was while COVID numbers are peaking, states are announcing new restrictions. Pfizer and Moderna both announced vaccines that are indicating 94% efficacy in preventing coronavirus. And they're going to both be filing for emergency use authorization with the FDA. But Molly, I saw something interesting in your Fahrenheit 411 this week that said that disinformation campaigns are going to be launching around the vaccines, which is terrifying. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're hearing and what we're kind of in for?
Sure. Some of the things that we're already seeing, despite the news just breaking this week about the vaccine, is baseless claims that the vaccine is going to be mandatory for children without parental consent, that the vaccine is going to be inserting microchips into people, that it'll alter DNA, that it is in some way a means of inflicting intentional harm on people who get the vaccine, all of which is obviously false. And it's a really difficult problem because the polling on this issue has indicated that about half the population would not get a COVID vaccine as of September. But Dr. Fauci and others have said that we'll need about 75% of the American population to get the vaccine in order for it to work effectively to combat the pandemic. So it's definitely a big problem. Some tech companies are responding. YouTube has announced that it's banning COVID vaccine disinformation and is attaching a link to different videos to send people to the CDC's website and to the WHO's website for the correct information. But others are slower to respond. For example, Facebook just last month banned anti-vaccine advertisements. So it kind of varies platform by platform and country by country, and even in some cases locality by locality. So it'll be interesting to see how the tech companies and local governments work to prevent vaccine disinformation.
So I'm curious, and I might be naive, who's behind that? Is it truly just crazy anti-vaxxers who think they're doing the right thing? Or is there what's the gain for anyone to be spreading this information? Where's it coming from?
I think a lot of it does come from the anti-vaxxer movement, which, as we all know, is already skeptical and fearful of vaccines, and why the government or whomever is interested in having the population take vaccines. I think it also comes from the just kind of general distrust that's been generated of the COVID pandemic in general. The health leaders have had a really hard time convincing people that this is even real. And so I think anti-vaccine disinformation kind of feeds into some of the patterns that we've already seen earlier in the pandemic.
I think there's also a lot of politicization of the entire process from both sides of the aisle, which have made things very difficult. A September poll, Pew found that only about 51% of Americans would take the vaccine, and it's pretty even among Democrats and Republicans. So, we saw a lot of politicization of the process of developing the vaccine, a lot of confusing sound bites taken out of context, making the rounds on social media. So I think it's really complicated by the fact that this is not a normal vaccine that, everyone knows is efficacious, everyone knows it was developed over a long period of time. This is something we're watching unfold in real time. And I think there's a lot of genuine confusion. When you hear your governor say that, we're not going to trust this vaccine if only the president tells us it's safe, that leads a lot of people to question whether or not it will be safe. So I think that's a big part of it.
So I want to dig into when you said that it's on both sides. It's coming from the Democrats. Is that a distrust if they saw it as Trump kind of fast forwarding something that wasn't fully tested, and that was the hesitancy with the vaccine? And do you think anything will change under a Biden administration, both with kind of lifting the voices of scientists, but also, how much the Trumpism kind of will be tamped down, if at all?
I mean, it's all very complicated, confusing, and not unified, which is the most important thing in a national response to a pandemic, is like a clear and consistent message. We learned from reputable reporting that President Trump has not attended a coronavirus briefing in a very long time, is getting his information already filtered through his vice president. And, a lot of the companies, Pfizer, I believe, was not originally working with Operation Warp Speed to develop their vaccine and only later started coordinating with them. Anyone who's conspiracy minded can point out that there are amazing immigrant Jewish scientists who are working for both Pfizer and Moderna, including my former beloved colleague Josephine Dalston's father at Pfizer. So you have this mix of both disinformation, as Molly described, but also just chaotic messaging that is making it very hard to get. Like, there's no consistent government response, certainly on a federal level and often on a state level, and sometimes it contradicts. So will it get better under Biden? I don't know.
Yeah, none of us have that crystal ball. It's interesting when you pointed out kind of the tying some of the anti-scientist stuff to being anti-Semitic. So why don't we jump on that, Amy? First, if you would kind of explain for people who may not be familiar with your organization what you do, but also maybe speak to the rise in some of this anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic tropes that are heating up, and then let's move into the recent FBI report.
Absolutely. So Integrity First for America, which is the small civil rights nonprofit I run, we are quite literally suing Nazis. This is the easiest way to explain it. We are backing a federal lawsuit brought by a coalition of Charlottesville community members against the 24 individuals and 8 groups that orchestrated the violence in Charlottesville 3 years ago, who, probably unsurprisingly to anyone on this call, are also deeply at the center of this larger white supremacist movement in America, with connections to not just what happened 3 years ago in Charlottesville, but also the Pittsburgh attack, the Christchurch attack, the Poway attack, and sort of the broader cycle of violence that we've seen. And we were talking about COVID just a few minutes ago. It's so important to understand how this year has really created a petri dish in some ways for anti-Semitism and other forms of far-right extremism to thrive, particularly in the face of the uncertainty of a pandemic, which brought out not just anti-Asian violence and hate, but anti-Semitic hate starting in February, March as the pandemic spread. with conspiracies related to, Jews being behind the virus, or Israel or the Jews withholding the vaccine, or any of the other conspiracies that are probably as old as time and just adapted for this moment. And then, of course, as the year went on, whether it be through the Black Lives Matter protests and the broader reckoning we're finally having on racial justice, we continue to see these racial and anti-Semitic tropes spread by a number of far-right extremists that so often mimic the same ones we've heard for years. The idea that George Soros is the puppet master behind these protests, much like they're now claiming he's the puppet master behind, voter fraud that is non-existent. And so we see it's the same formula each and every time. There's a Jewish puppet master pulling the strings that's responsible for everything terrible that's happening in our world, whether it be the pandemic, whether it be the racial justice reckoning that these white supremacists, of course, did not like, or whether it be Biden's win and the fake voter fraud that they're spreading. And this ties to the broader anti-Semitic replacement theory that fuels so much of both the violence that we've seen in recent years and these conspiracy theories. The idea that, quote, Jews will not replace us directly speaks to this idea that Jews are the puppet masters orchestrating the, quote, replacement of the white race by supporting the Black community, the immigrant community, the Latinx community, and any other community that these white supremacists feel doesn't fit into their narrow vision for this country. And so you can't look at any of these things, whether it be Charlottesville or the violence since, or the various conspiracies that we're talking about here, in a silo. They're all part of this broader rising anti-Semitism, so often fueled by these same sort of conspiracy theories.
Molly, I believe you, am I right? You're the one who interviewed Greenblatt from the ADL.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit what he was saying as far as what he sees as the cause of the uptick since 2017, what's happening, what his response was to the FBI report?
When we talked about the FBI report, the ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Center and other people who kind of track these numbers, in addition to being concerned about the rising tide of anti-Semitism, really did highlight the lack of reporting in this year's report. This was the second year in a row, rather, that local agencies that report their hate crime data to the FBI, that number declined. So fewer agencies are either reporting data at all. More are reporting, zero numbers of hate crimes. So while our conversation did speak to concerns about, just as Amy said, a petri dish is a great way to describe it. It's just the sort of news cycle the past couple of years has been ripe for the growth of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Many people would point to some rhetoric from the federal government also fanning the flames of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. But the focus this year for a number of the agencies that I spoke to was on the underreporting problem, which suggests that the problem is actually worse than we even know about. And actually, just one more thing on, Amy addressed the classic George Soros anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that we saw this election cycle. We featured in the newsletter this week a sort of different anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that I had really not seen, which was circulating in the wake of Joe Biden's victory, which basically baselessly said that Israel conspired against Donald Trump during his re-election campaign, which is very interesting, in part because President Trump polls very well with Israeli Jews, and this one is really just completely baseless and of a sort of new tone than George Soros related conspiracy theories that we had seen in the lead up to the election and in the days following.
Interesting. Laura, I believe JTA was talking about that. One of the challenges is that domestic terrorism is not yet classified as a federal hate crime. Why can you speak to why that's significant? I feel like I'm catching you off guard. I didn't ask you this earlier. And if not, I'm sure Amy could address this, but why is that significant in terms of maybe compelling reporting of hate crimes?
I think Amy or Molly could honestly probably speak better to that than I could, but I do want to mention before we we go on to the real world stuff, there's a really good nonpartisan think tank called the Network Contagion Research Institute that tracks in real time the flow of and the volume of these anti-Semitic memes and conspiracy theories, and how different prejudices, whether that's anti-Semitism, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, anti-Black racism, kind of feed and cycle into each other. And we know from their research that every single high-profile terror attack on the Jewish community that we've had in recent years can be traced to online hate and conspiracy theories. So something I'm really concerned about and I'm watching carefully this year when everyone is inside and online is, I'm concerned that the rise in online anti-Semitism will later lead to a rise in in-person anti-Semitism. I would imagine the 2020 numbers are not necessarily going to reflect all of the things that are brewing online.
No, I was hearing about a new social media platform, Parlay, and that because they're not restricting any of this speech, it's kind of making it harder for Facebook, Twitter, some of those more traditional platforms to push back. Molly, is this something you're hearing about? Can you explain that?
Yes, I also spoke to Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL about Parler. And what's interesting is there's kind of two schools of thought about the upsides and downsides of Parler drawing more hateful actors away from mainstream platforms. On the one hand, maybe it's better that the platforms with the widest reach are seeing this departure because it's just a sheer numbers game that, fewer people are going to be exposed to hateful and conspiratorial content. But the flip side of that is that as hateful actors congregate in spaces like Parler, like Gab, like Telegram, like 4chan, the classic one, those spaces become more and more siloed, and you might have the experience of someone who is radicalized through going to Parler and being surrounded by almost exclusively hateful content. And Jonathan also raised the concern that the movement of some mainstream conservative politicians, pundits, journalists to Parler would add legitimacy to the more extremist factions of that platform.
And if I can jump in here, I think it's so important to understand that no social media site is obligated to give any oxygen to these extremists, despite what they might claim or despite what increasingly Republican politicians are claiming here. That is not what the First Amendment says. That's not what free speech is about. These are private sites where we all agree to terms of service when we sign up. And it's also important to understand that deplatforming works. So while everything Molly said is true, that there are very real concerns about the silos that are developing here, we also know that by limiting the reach on more mainstream sites of these extremists, it has very real impacts. And I believe Molly covered this over the summer. Richard Spencer, who is perhaps one of the most well-known neo-Nazis in the country, a defendant in our lawsuit, was in court earlier this summer in our case, complaining about how the case has been financially crippling and that he hasn't been able to raise money because he's been deplatformed from traditional social media sites. And so take it, not from me, but from the horse's mouth. Deplatforming works when it comes to the ability of these extremists to raise not just money, but support and stature. There are obviously broader challenges as we go down the rabbit hole of the 8kuns and 4chans and Parlers of the world. And I think a solution here needs to not just involve the social media companies themselves, but the domain registration, web hosting companies that can play a role in making sure we're not legitimizing and giving a platform to violent hate anywhere.
Yeah, I think the evidence is very clear, as Molly and Amy both pointed out, that taking down disinformation and hate speech leads to fewer people seeing those conspiracies and buying into them. What is less well known is, the effects that, social media, in a lot of ways, its biggest thing that it's done that I see is it's really mainstreamed and legitimized a lot of non-reputable sources of information, because It prioritizes things that your friends and family share. And when your crazy aunt or uncle share a non-reputable news source, someone that's not a careful reader of information is going to take that as reputable because it's on their nice, clean, beautiful Silicon Valley designed Facebook or Twitter feed. So I think Parler is just the latest version of, you know, these non-mainstream sites that get touted by, I would say, bad actors as alternatives that aren't necessarily going to lead anywhere. Something we haven't mentioned, which is more, I did a long interview with Nadine Strawson, who used to lead the ACLU for a long time. And the ACLU is obviously very, very hard line, like we should not be censoring speech, even if obviously the First Amendment does not protect people from private company censorship, but she championed something called counter speech. We can play this whack-a-mole game of taking down misinformation, but it's actually more important to provide quality sources of education and information that, you know, point out the Holocaust was real, that, you know, George Soros is not a puppet master of the United States political system. So I'm interested to see what, you know, the ADL and news organizations come up with to fill that void.
That was the same strategy that I know we were advised at JWI to approach when dealing with misogyny on social media platforms, especially around women running for elected office, was to just kind of, you know, throw up as much truth to counter some of those lies. Amy, can you dive into not only this, but also, you know, last week there was the MAGA march. We've heard about the appointments of Darren Beattie to the government position that actually monitors Holocaust sites. You know, what is this about getting neo-Nazis, anti-Semites, white nationalists, not only into the mainstream, but into positions of power in our government?
I just think this week has really encapsulated how desensitized we've come to just that, to the fact that neo-Nazis and white supremacists have actually in the last 4 years taken on very real positions of power in the White House. When you look at someone like Stephen Miller, who's an avowed white nationalist, and you see that in how his policies translate. And the embrace that has gone from dog whistles and winks to explicit, outspoken support for the Proud Boys and white supremacists and other groups, culminating perhaps in this Darren Beattie appointment, which I would highly recommend. I think Huffington Post had a new article today. I know Molly and GTA have both covered this appointment. This isn't just about him sitting on a panel with another white supremacist. He has a long public history of supporting and publicly embracing white supremacist and white nationalist ideas. But we've become so desensitized to the fact that, you know, not just white supremacists being appointed to Holocaust commissions, but the fact, you know, that on Saturday, thousands of white supremacists and other far-right extremists stormed DCs with swastika flags and Confederate flags, and some were seemingly involved in a stabbing on Saturday night. And we've barely talked about that in the days since. That a congressman-elect, Madison Cawthorn in North Carolina earlier this week, talked about all this anti-Semitic nonsense about converting Jews to Christianity, which was just a few days ago in an interview, I think, with Jewish Insider. And this is after he talked about how visiting Hitler's summer house was on his bucket list. And of course, we already talked about how hate crimes have hit record levels. According to this new FBI report, the ADL has affirmed that 2019 saw the largest number of anti-Semitic incidents on record. The Department of Homeland Security just a few weeks ago called white supremacy the most persistent and lethal threat to our country. You know, you can go on, and there are all these examples of how dire this threat is and how mainstream some of these extremists have become in our politics, whether it be as members elect to Congress, like not just Madison Cawthorn, but the QAnon supporters who are going to be seated in Congress in January, or in government commissions or otherwise. And so there's a feeling among some that come January 20th, we will have sort of survived the Trump era and this issue of anti-Semitism and broader white supremacy is going to go away. But that's simply not true. the mainstreaming of extremism over the last 4 years has done such deep damage to our democracy and to our security that it's going to take a very concerted effort, not just by the Biden administration, but by state and local governments and law enforcement, and by NGOs and the private sector, including, of course, social media companies, as we've been talking about, to begin to sort of right the ship. And, at least for us, we think one way to do that is to also use our justice system to do that. We are taking to court in April the leaders of this movement for their violent conspiracy in Charlottesville 3 years ago, and that will at least not just have the ability to bankrupt and dismantle them through large civil judgments, but also send a very clear public message about the legal financial consequences for being part of these violent conspiracies. That is just one tool in a much larger toolbox we need to be utilizing.
So outside of the tremendous work that Integrity First is doing, do you see, and please any of you answer this, an appetite for the kind of work that Amy just laid out that needs to be done by local and state and national government? What is the hope for kind of turning the tide on what's happening?
I think that people who are paying attention are very alarmed. And Amy mentioned the QAnon conspiracy theory, which we haven't really addressed so much this talk, but people who understand the widespread and pervasive nature of that theory, not only in different parts of the government, but among civilians, I think would have an appetite for action by state and local governments, in particular by the social media companies. I think that something that doesn't get underlined enough is that the radicalization of the American population has not happened without encouragement, frankly, from social media companies that have recommended conspiratorial and disinforming content to people who otherwise would have never stumbled across it under normal circumstances on their newsfeed.
100%.
So Amy, I do want to give you a chance to just tell people if they want to learn more about your work and to support it, if you can give them a website or more information.
Thank you. You can visit integrityfirstforamerica.org, where you can read the actual lawsuit, which is, I think, sadly, the best encapsulation of what happened in Charlottesville 3 years ago. It's really the place where that story is told in full. And as we've discussed, that Charlottesville really served as a harbinger or a preview of the cycle of violence that's followed. There's so much to talk about that won't be able to fit into our time here. But the tools and the tactics that were used in Charlottesville, in addition to the actual players that were taken to court, have cropped up over and over and over again over the last 3 years. And so I think understanding Charlottesville really is a perfect way to understand the broader cycle of violence that's followed. And one of the key tools we have to fight back, which is the use of our justice system. So you can visit integrityfirstforamerica.org, read the lawsuit, sign up for case updates, donate if you're so inclined, which funds security costs for our legal team and for my team at IFA and our plaintiffs are incredibly brave, as well as evidence collection and other needs. And I think also you can read the coverage from the Forward and GTA that has of our case in our newsroom section. So sort of the synergy of this whole panel coming together. I think that when we go to trial in April, it will send an enormously powerful message on this issue. It's not the silver bullet. There's so much more that needs to be done, as we've been discussing, from a government perspective, from a private sector perspective, from an NGO perspective. But this is one critical tool that we have that we can use to fight back, to bankrupt and dismantle these groups and these leaders, and to make crystal clear that if you're part of these sorts of violent conspiracies, there will be very real consequences.
Thank you for that. So in the final minutes, Laura, let's turn to something a little more fun. I think I read on JTA First, some big announcement about one of my favorite movies and Jewish woman extraordinaire, Gal Gadot. Do you want to mention what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's going to be streaming, I believe, on Christmas Day is the choice.
Right. And this is the new Wonder Woman movie we're talking about.
Yes. I'm not a big movie person and I'm not a big superhero movie person, but I absolutely loved the first one with her. I think just so many things, like to have a movie that passes the Bechdel test at every moment, which is, for those not familiar, the idea that two women have a conversation that does not involve talking about another man. And that whole movie is just, it's such an empowering story. And I also find it hilarious, like everyone trying to copy Gal Gadot's Israeli accent, all the actors doing their best to kind of make that the accent on her island.
Or Amazonia or whatever.
Yeah, I think she's such, Gal Gadot is such a powerful role model for so many people because she is very strong, but she's also like she's mastered the art of being soft spoken when she needs to be, and also very fiery when she needs to be, both on the silver screen and off. So that's one bright spot to 2020.
Well, I love that they decided to stream it because originally they were going to insist on it being only in theaters, so they kept pushing back the date. But now I think it will be released in theaters. I don't know who's going to see it in theaters, but also on HBO Max. So I'm excited to continue the Jewish tradition of seeing a movie on Christmas and celebrating with Jewish woman extraordinaire. And I have to point out that she was pregnant when she filmed the first Wonder Woman movie, which extraordinary that she fit into that costume, but to do it while pregnant is just a superhero feat. Molly, we have Thanksgiving coming up. I just want to know, how are you celebrating Thanksgiving now that the CDC said, stay home? And also, what are you grateful for?
Luckily, my parents also live in New York City, so I'll be joining my parents. Unfortunately, my sister lives in New Orleans and is not making the trip. So, a sort of bittersweet celebration for sure. But I'm feeling grateful for a lot this Thanksgiving. I feel lucky to be healthy. I feel lucky to be employed. I feel lucky that my family is safe and healthy. I think that this holiday is really bringing into focus just what a difficult year it's been. And, I'm trying to just focus on the positive because I do have so much to be grateful for, despite all of the hardship, that we've all experienced as a result of the pandemic.
Amy, how about you? Same question.
I don't think I could put it better. I think, we'll be celebrating, my husband, my dog, and I, keeping it small to be safe and fit some family on Zoom from around the area. Because there's a new baby in the family and a 97-year-old grandfather, and we just want to keep everyone safe. So we're going to celebrate virtually. And I'm not going to try to cook. We're definitely ordering in. But I just feel very grateful that in a year where so much has gone wrong, I have my health and a job that I love, and my family has all been healthy and safe throughout all of this. And I'm going to try to keep it that way by celebrating responsibly this Thanksgiving.
Laura?
Yeah, I'm not, it's Thanksgiving's like the last thing I'm thinking about until probably the week of. But I think Molly said it best. I would just add, I'm so grateful for all the scientists at all of the health companies that have been working on a vaccine, whether successful or not. Like, just the amount of academic collaboration within that industry has been unprecedented. And of course, also for all of the state and local officials who are working to make sense of chaotic guidelines, and all of the healthcare workers who are doing their best to get people through the pandemic.
It's beautiful. And I would add all the scientists who've come before, who laid the foundation for the work that allowed this group of scientists to be able to move as quickly as they have to find a safe vaccine. I'm with you. We're just celebrating with our immediate family. Thanksgiving is a holiday that my mother used to be the host, and then I inherited a couple of years ago, and I always took such great pride in really planning a fun day for all the relatives who came to visit. So I'll be missing that, but I am going to try and recreate it as much as possible for the four of us. And I'm also grateful this year for the communities and connections we've been able to build through things like this. that we didn't think of, even though Zoom was here before, how now we know how to use it to really, especially in a time of such isolation, to find a really accessible way to pull people together. And I'm thankful for everyone who listens every week and logs on to Women of the Week. I just want to remind everyone, next week we are taking a break for Thanksgiving, so we won't be doing the show. The following week, December 4th, is JWI's big annual gala. We are going to be virtual this year. We're calling it our Impact Summit. It's a half-day event. Of course, we don't expect you to be online the entire half day, although I think once you start watching, you're not going to be able to log off. It's going to be so fascinating. And Women on the Week will be part of that summit. You can donate to get a link at jwi.org/WTW for Women to Watch. And I just want to let everyone know on this call that if the donation that's being asked for to get a link is too much, either reach out to me at mjacobs@jwi.org, or simply donate what you're comfortable donating through our donation page and put in the comment line that it's for Women on the Week. And I'll make sure you get a link so you can join us on December 4th. So with that, I want to thank everyone on this panel. You're tremendous. Please, everyone, read Molly and Laura and all the incredible journalism on The Forward and JTA. Check out Amy's work, and Shabbat Shalom, and stay healthy. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.
So much.